Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's live event. My name is Kelly Barner. I'm the head of content and operations here at Art of Procurement, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's conversation. So our topic today is 3 perspectives on procurement risk, specifically for mid-sized organizations. Now, a lot of what you're going to hear today is sort of narrative based on firsthand experience, but we do also have some data underpinnings to this conversation. The findings from an Economist Impact study are something that the Art of Procurement team had the opportunity to analyze to pull out some key findings. And so we'll be sort of wrapping around that, the SAP perspective and a very interesting perspective from Cirque du Soleil. So now before I bring my guests on stage with you today, I just want to share a little bit of housekeeping information if you've never joined us for these events. The first thing you will notice, there are no slides. So no, we will not be sharing a copy of the slides after today's webinar. There aren't any. This is a purely live conversation that you have an important part to play in. If you look at the right-hand side of your screen, assuming you're here with us live, you see a nice big chat panel. There will be all kinds of exchange going on there. And in fact, we already have a few questions and comments that have come in. The other thing you will notice down below this video is that there's a little emoji button. If you don't necessarily have a specific comment or question, you can sort of let our speakers know that you hear them, that you agree by picking one of those options, and you will see that float up past the screen as well. Now, without further ado, let me tell you who we are going to talk to today and bring them up on stage. I would like to welcome Stephanie LeRoy, and I apologize, I'm going to take the cop out and do the American version because I know I can't get close with the French. Stephanie LeRoy is the Senior Director of Procurement for Cirque du Soleil Entertainment Group, and Callum Veness. He is the Senior Director of Product Marketing at SAP Procurement and External Workforce. So Stephanie and Callum, thank you both so much for being here and welcome.
Good morning, Kelly. Good morning, Callum, and good morning, everyone.
And Callum, I'm not sure we have your audio. I see that you're unmuted, but I don't actually hear you. If you want to take a second and check your settings. But while you do that, Stephanie, let's get to know you a little bit better. We have sort of this trademark question here at Art of Procurement. Did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
That's a very good question. I would say probably it's a mix of them. I do have quite an atypical career path. I wasn't looking for a procurement job basically when I entered at Cirque du Soleil, and this is where I've started to do some procurement. I was ending my master degree from Paris in one of the economic French school, and then I was looking for a job, and I had the opportunity to work with Cirque du Soleil in the procurement department, and I accepted it because the company was really appealing to me, and then I think it was the start of enjoying working with the procurement and continuing developing myself within that department.
And that's fantastic. And I see we've got some shared love here for Cirque du Soleil. I also love Cirque du Soleil. So very much looking forward to hearing from you today. Callum, let's see if I have your audio. Can you say something for me?
Yeah, can you hear me now, Kelly?
I can hear you loud and clear. So Callum, same question to you then. Did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Procurement very much found me. So I had the opportunity to enter the tech consulting space a little over 15 years ago, and had started to work in the spend management, procurement and sourcing, supply chain as well. And then obviously got to start working with SAP and SAP Ariba. And then had the pleasure of, through that journey, working with hundreds of different customers all over the world, undertaking their procurement journey as well. So came in through the consulting route, fell in love with procurement, and have stayed here ever since.
Well, don't even think about leaving because we're not planning on letting you go. So we're glad you both found your way here, and we're glad you're both willing to share your experience. Now, Stephanie, Cirque du Soleil is very different from many of the companies that we speak with, many of the companies in our audience. So let me ask you a couple of questions first, just to get sort of an understanding of the circumstances that you're working in. We know that you have both resident and traveling shows. how is it that you and your team manage not only the agreements, but also the suppliers associated with each model?
Definitely. So yes, we do have two types of shows: the resident shows, mostly in Vegas, but also in Orlando, and we're looking forward to have furthers elsewhere in the world. We also have some in Mexico. Traveling shows, there's a differentiation. So we do have big top shows. It's a kind of big village that will stay about 6 to 8 weeks in a city, and then we'll move from city to city. And then we have our arena shows performing in arenas, and they will mostly remain a week in a city and then move from city to city. Supplier-wise, we commonly use the same suppliers with resident and the touring shows. However, touring shows will have more specific needs just by the fact that they're traveling from one city to another, and will require a little bit more operational support. Just in terms of logistics, moving one show from a city to another in a big top show is basically 70 trucks, 53-footers on the road. So those are huge transportation needs and requirements. Same if we are moving from one continent to another, but we also will have some travel and lodging for employees. We will require some temporary staff labor on the ground in each city to help us with the food and beverage, the ushers, and whomever in the front of house when you come and have the experience of the show. So those type of very big needs on the operational standpoint of view will not be necessary with the resident show. So we have two separate teams in the procurement, one overseeing in Las Vegas the resident shows, and then one team here in Montreal overseeing the operational and touring show division.
Now,
and I was going to say,
yeah.
Aside from that, we also have a production and special event team, because of course we're always looking to put in place new shows. And we do have a lot of special events happening. So they are very short, ephemeral and ad hoc shows that will be anywhere on the planet. So we do have a team for that as well. And then not forgetting as well the everything related to the corporate side of Cirque du Soleil, and a specific team as well for that.
It actually is just occurring to me in this moment, we definitely should have pulled some Cirque du Soleil background music for this conversation. Huge missed media opportunity. I'm going to make a note to myself for that for future events.
Next time, Kelly.
I'm hearing, like, in the back of my head, the soundtrack to O. So part of what we're going to hear you talk about today is, against all of that complexity you just talked about, and certainly the sophistication of procurement that goes with it, the transformation journey that you and your team have gone on. And I know that process efficiency was one of your core objectives. Mm-hmm. When you think about what the investments in transformation have allowed you and your team to do from a process efficiency and acceleration standpoint, how much faster would you say you're able to move in response to all of these different needs?
I would say, that all the needs are different. So of course, when we're speaking about temp staff, logistic, lodging, it's not the same thing as buying, anything from hardware or makeup and any other type of commodity. So of course, we see them differently. In terms of speeding up the process, definitely with the smaller and more frequent purchases, this is where we had in the last few years strengthen our way of doing things and making sure that we were optimizing our operations. So a purchasing platform such as, and I will just share it because it's the one we're using. We're using Ariba, and definitely implementing catalogs for resident shows and our corporate a part of our corporate clients definitely helped us in moving faster in purchasing small purchases and very frequent ones, because just by that, our technical buyers can do anything aside from just making POs and for very small value items. On our side, and I think it's important that I clarify that we are using the platform, the purchasing platform and catalogs specifically for our residential and the corporate office, our headquarters in Montreal, just because the touring shows and the special events are a lot more complex in terms of taxation, fiscality, and all, the address where to deliver, all the the numbers, the taxation, and I'm looking for the word, and I will not find it just because I want to find it. But our branch and will change, and it will take too much human background in the system to be efficient for us.
Yeah. Now, Callum, when I think about the circumstances that Stephanie's talking about, not just that Cirque du Soleil has as a company, but that the procurement team has, it makes me think that the company has to have a great deal of confidence, not just in her team's ability to deliver, but in their ability to collaborate both inside and outside of the organization. And this brings us to the first of the three perspectives we're going to talk about today that comes from that Economist Impact survey, which is the close association between the business's confidence in procurement and procurement's ability to collaborate. So what we found from the data is that nearly 60% of companies believe procurement's insights are valuable. Absolutely, although we'd love to see that number go higher. And yet, less than half of those same respondents, about 44%, believe procurement collaborates effectively with the business, which creates a huge confidence gap, whether that capability is actually there or not. Based on your experience and perspective, do you think procurement has an actual capability problem, or is it a perception that the business holds that we're not strong enough in collaboration or that our data is not actionable enough?
Yeah, it's an absolutely a really great question, Kelly. And I think the answer in very simple terms, it's both, right, as well. And I think one of the things that the paper teases out that I just want to really highlight in prefacing the answer is that dichotomy that procurement has faced over the past 4 years, 5 years now, and ongoing, right? We've seen procurement, particularly mid-sized organizations now reporting to directly CEO. That's been the nirvana state for the last 15, 20 years that we saw it as a procurement function. But at the same token, every opportunity or macroeconomic event, threat to the organization is driving that break glass and core procurement as well. And I think that's important to start to note. And so I think as you start to look at, is it a capability problem and or a confidence problem, we need to start to look at them a little bit separately and then bring it together. So I think as we look at the capability component, there was a fantastic study done, published in Harvard Business Review, right? It was conducted by Alix Partners, and it looked that pre-pandemic mid-sized organizations were growing at a faster rate than large enterprise, as well as small to medium enterprises on the lower scale. So from a positional advantage, they had the ability to really leverage the disruption that we saw with the pandemic and the perma crisis, and really start to change the game and grow rapidly through that case. But they found that wasn't the case as well. And as they've gone through and analyzed why that wasn't the case, it came down to two different perspectives, right? The first one was data and talent, right? Knowing what to do and then being able to do it and start to execute. So not having the data, not having the talent, and not knowing what to do really starts to point at that capability, right, kind of gap from where we are to where we need to be and how we start to drive. And I think if you start to look at what the Harvard Business Review paper articulates and you compare it against, say, like the Hackett CPO agenda, which whilst not mid-sized, you'll see year over year some form of capability is coming through from a gap. So some of the things that we'll start to talk about talk with customers about is where are you today in terms of your capability, and how does that compare to where you as procurement as a cost savings function, right, in terms of what we're famous for as procurement, and where are you against the value creator, and what does that mean? And then I think it comes back to the perception component, right, the confidence problem as well. And I think around that, if we look at, again, just using Hackett as an example, acting as a strategic business partner, that's been in the top 10 for large enterprise and mid-sized organizations, at least back to 2018, and I dare say beyond on that, right? I just know off the top of my head the last kind of 5 to 6 years as well. And I think when we start to then extrapolate that and work with customers, we start to ask the question around that, does procurement engage with the business? Yes or no? If so, how are they engaging with the business? Does procurement understand what the business's goals are, right? Whether that be the business unit's goals, the broader business, really at both levels. So like Stephanie spoke around, working with the traveling shows, working with the resident shows, working with corporate, what are the individual business goals? Does the business understand the full value of what procurement can bring, right, to the table? We'll get different conversations around the value proposition of procurement, but then I'll also sit there and talk with procurement teams. And as we're talking with them, someone will come over and go, I've got this contract agreed with the customer. I just need to knock them down 5%, right? Could you jump in and help right at this late stage as well, right? And so it's really that true understanding is, what is the value procurement bring? And do you kind of align those over the 3 years, right? So we would look at that through things like, do you have a joint success scorecard? How is procurement influencing the business's goals? How are you tracking that over the longer term? And if the answer across any of that is no, then what it starts to tell us is that there's a lack of an interlock or understanding on both sides as to what they're trying to achieve. And then that can just introduce perception or confidence or a misunderstanding through that process. So ultimately, I think it's a little bit of both. There's a capability gap and there's a confidence gap as we look at how procurement interlocks and understands their role in the business.
Well, and I do also find it interesting when we bring that back to actually where you started was talking about the nirvana, as you put it, of procurement getting to report directly to the CEO. It seems like it would be a good time for that, but not necessarily for the reasons procurement always would have asked for it. That around this perception issue, if the CEO is seeing through his or her eyes exactly what's going on, hopefully that takes the perception misunderstanding out of the question. But also when we think about a feedback loop, an effective CEO doesn't beat around the bush, comes right out and says what needs to be said in a constructive way, of course. But if it doesn't have to filter through multiple levels of the organization, you have sort of this perception piece clearing up. But then also, if it's an iterative process to change procurement's focus or skill set, you're getting that immediate feedback with an opportunity to change what's being done. Because that confidence at the end of the day comes down to the relationships we're able to form. And so, Stephanie, if I come back to you on that, you talked about doing smaller, more frequent buys, which also implies more contact with the business, potentially more decisions to be made. How do you consciously invest in those relationships with different points within the business, whether it's on the decision-making level or whether it's at that executive level, like Callum was talking about?
Well, I think one point that Callum mentioned and that is very important is the capacity and capability. So definitely, I would say the first motto I use is information is key. We definitely need to have data to analyze it and then position ourselves. And for me, effective procurement department will have good information from our systems just to ensure that we can treat it, analyze it, and then present it and take actions over this data. That's the first step. So on our side, we do have, and we've put back in place because I would just mention, that Cirque du Soleil was closed during the pandemic, and we had the relaunch in 2021 starting. So for the first year and a half until end of 2022, the Cirque du Soleil was bringing back, employees and we were rebuilding ourselves. So we made sure that we had our governance and system team, strong enough just to ensure that our systems are at the top level, and ensuring we put and invest into the data retrieving and putting in place some KPIs that will help us in position ourselves into the organization. So on a stakeholder standpoint of view, well, when you have strong KPIs and you can show the savings you're bringing to the company, when you show the system efficiency that brings to the company, when you show anything in regards to ESG or whatsoever KPIs you put in place on your side, definitely will bring some visibility to the stakeholders and executives of your company.
Yeah.
On our side, we have an annual review of all our KPIs, but we've decided as well now to put it on a quarterly basis, and to ensure as well that we imply and we give the visibility to our VPs of divisions and financial directors on a quarterly basis, as I was mentioning, where we're at during the year with our savings and what we do, our added value at the procurement. So this helps us in showing, what we can bring to each of the divisions. Now, again, this data that we'll pull out of the system will help us as well in taking decisions on which supplier we'll insert into the system, where we're going to focus during the year in terms of spend and commodities, or so the main message for me and where we're putting our efforts, first of all, is to have a strong database and information which help us in positioning and playing around with the information.
Because you're really trying to create two different kinds of experience at the same time. You certainly have the audience experience, which is absolutely critical, but there's also that internal experience of working with procurement. We talked about perception at the executive level. We also don't want to be perceived as inefficient or overly administrative at the decision-making and buying level. And that brings us to the second perspective that we're going to talk about today, which is the range of expectations around what actually constitutes a good user experience from procurement. I mean, you can put 100 people in a room and ask them to write on a piece of paper what constitutes a good procurement experience. You're going to get at least 95 different pieces of feedback from those people. So we're sort of trying to create something that's maybe not as straightforward as the data that we're trying to bring to bear in decision making. Now, Callum, this takes us back to some of the research. And I think today, when you say user experience, you instantly, or I should say, I instantly start to think about digital usability, because for many people, that is where they will meet procurement. It's not a face, it's an interface. And if we think about where each organization is around confidence in procurement's data, their ability to collaborate, you wonder where questioning and those relationships as they stand plays into what they feel about the experience. So I'd be interested, if we think about the experience piece for a minute, how can procurement strengthen soft skills, strengthen those relationships, build that trust, but without losing sight of the business impact that we're ultimately trying to work together to create?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this comes back to collaboration, as well as you start to see, and how we're able to engage with the business and collaborate, as Stephanie spoke to as well. And when I look at what makes effective collaboration, particularly coming from say, a consulting background, we would say soft skills are hard skills as well. And first and foremost, as well, comes to communication, right? Procurement has very much its own language, how we talk, as well. And the best analogy I've come up over the years is when you're sitting down at Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner, or the relevant kind of family gathering that you have in your part of the world, and you try and explain what you do to friends and families that are outside that world, and they just stare at you blankly. It really kind of brings to the forefront that communication. And so, as procurement, we can speak within the procurement language to procurement, but then how we then would speak with other stakeholders in the organization, whether that be IT, whether that be finance, whether that be the business, being able to switch almost between language, right, in terms of how we communicate, bring it into the layman term to be able to create that better collaboration and interlock there as well. And I think the second thing around that, kind of moving on from around interpersonal skills, is the viewpoint, right, around, and this might be a little bit different to some views, right, but procurement in my mind is not the hero, right? We are there to help facilitate the business outcome and obviously the business to growth goals by being that stewardess of value and spend management. And so that really places us, we're not the hero, we're the sidekick, right? And I think of the movies and Hollywood and the shows that the Cirque puts on, and around that role of the sidekick as well. And that means in many instances we don't have a direct decision stake, right? We often do, So the ability to influence without authority, right? The skill sets around that. How do you plant and influence the discussions that's going on when procurement's brought into the conversation are probably the two most critical skills in working with customers around the world that we just don't see enough of to really help them kind of, create that interlock, that better collaboration, and, ultimately that user experience in terms of how they're engaging with the broader business.
And yet it's interesting because we are trying to create a not tension, not friction, but there has to be a balance. I think in some cases, and I think back to even my days in procurement, I know there are users or stakeholders that if I had said to them, if I want to create the best possible experience for you, what should I do? They would say, quit and don't replace yourself. Just let me do whatever I want. Let me spend money, however much I want with whatever I want. Okay. Yep. I hear where you're coming from on that. We're not going to do that this way. So there does need to be this counterbalance of what is the company looking for procurement to do versus what are distributed users looking for procurement to do. And so, Callum, I guess as a follow-up to what we just talked about, what would you say are some of the signs or symptoms that procurement has done a good job of balancing individual user or team expectations with what the company wants when we think about that experience that we create digitally or otherwise?
Yeah, I think ultimately there's two ways that we need to look at this, right? It comes down to qualitative feedback and quantitative feedback. So I think the quantitative, are we hitting the goals? Are we delivering the value that we set off? Are we moving the needle against that 3 to 5 year plan? And are we incrementally moving that, forward and so forth as well? I think as part of that quantitative, getting customer satisfaction, sentiment, and NPS, that feedback is absolutely key as well. And if we're not in a position to do that, qualitative is that gravy. Because we can absolutely be hitting the goals and driving, savings and mitigating risk. But if the users hate us, then ultimately they're going to try and avoid us, right? Exactly to your point there, Kelly, as well. And so I think getting that sentiment and getting that feedback as well is kind of absolutely key. And how often and how frequent are you getting it? And you can measure that as simple as emails coming in into procurement, right? And there's one experience that stuck with me again, right? Exactly that stakeholder that you spoke of. I was working with a customer. They told me I was ruining their life. It was horrible. Why are we doing this from a transformation standpoint? And around 3 months later, they came back. I had the opportunity to work with them again, and they actually apologized as well. They said, look, I have to apologize, right? It was just change. It was that unknown. It was as well, I didn't know what to do. Now that we're utilizing, right, I've got the visibility. It's actually much easier than what it used to be. And I'm able to collaborate better because I don't need to pick up the phone and ruin someone's day. I can get that instantaneous visibility of what I need to do all the way through the process. And I think kind of that's where some of the change management kind of components and barriers come in. But I think ultimately that user experience is quantitative where you can, right? And absolutely drive quantitative as much as possible. Qualitative is key. And the last kind of comment on this is I think it's not only internal, right, feedback and experience that you need to drive, but also your supply base, right? Asking them, what's the voice of your supplier? Have they got a positive interaction? What could they do to improve as well? And in many cases, what we've actually found is it's the suppliers that will help bring the business over the line and help kind of drive that collaboration outcome, because the business is doing their best interest to protect what they think their supply base is, but it's actually counterintuitive. So long story short, quantitative as much as possible, qualitative overlaying it, and then users internal to your company as well as users from your suppliers is absolutely key.
And then, Stephanie, if we take those perspectives and sort of carry them over to your firsthand experience, what are some of the things that you and your team are doing to either invest in, strengthen, or measure the current relative success of the internal and or external experience that your team creates?
Well, we try to do a lot of things. Just as I think procurement department has always the challenge of ensuring a good collaboration with all the stakeholders internally to our corporation. I think the most important, and Callum and you as well, Kelly, I mentioned it, communication. Communication is one of the key components. Taking the time to explain as well exactly the process and what we will do. Because from my experience, most of the time, people will think that we're there to take away the control and the power that they may have in doing a deal, in showing that they've did the saving or that they negotiated. So what we try to explain in our team to our colleagues in Cirque du Soleil is to ensure that they are subject matter experts, the people that will decide the sets and the designs and the lighting, the audio, the stage, automation. Yes, of course, with time, we'll understand, and that's as well very important to that the people accompanying the business, the buyers and the councils and senior councils in our teams are understanding what they're buying. However, the end users and our clients are definitely the subject expert matters. And what we try to make them understand is they need to focus on that, share with us the information, and then we are the subject expert matters in negotiating, put a contract in place, and ensuring that we're protecting Cirque du Soleil in the right way. Most of the time, when we take the time, to explain, it does help and understand. I think that we also need to have a strong service à la clientèle, just to ensure that, we accompany them in their daily task and throughout the process of going on an RFP in the market, and explaining and keeping them up to date of what's happening. Because someone who doesn't have the visibility of us and discussing with the suppliers may wonder what's happening, where we're at. So explaining, keeping them up to date of what's happening, where we're at, what are the results, what are the analysis. On our side, we never take the decision, but recommendation. So the more the internal client will be into the process, the better the outcome will be. Aside from communication and people, I think that definitely having a strong policy and governance in place, and definitely having the executive supporting and putting, in front on the front stage the policy, definitely will help for sure. System-wise, if you have a good system, as I was mentioning earlier, the data you will retrieve will help you in positioning yourself better into the company. And also, I would say, in the system, you also need to have the people skills, as you were mentioning, Callum and Kelly, are super important, because having a system will be good. But if you don't have the service à la clientèle also helping your end users, working correctly on the system, helping them when they will face some errors or challenges with the system, helping the suppliers and all of it, well, you go on the wrong side of things. So on my side, when we rebuilt the team at Cirque du Soleil, we ensured that we had strong interpersonal skills people to work with us, because definitely this is, in my perspective, a very strong asset for the procurement department.
No, and I agree with you. And I think even in terms of those interpersonal skills, Callum, to your point about the soft skills being the hard skills, I think an awful lot of what we do is motivated by empathy when we're effective. We've all, from a consumer standpoint, been in that frame of mind where we're thinking, where is my stuff? And people are thinking that in a B2B setting as well. And even, Stephanie, when you talked about keeping the business informed, procurement might have the best of intentions. We might think, oh, these people are so busy, we're not going to bother them until we have something concrete or until we have good news to share. But they're sitting someplace wondering where their stuff is, and they may be unintentionally sort of filling that negative space with the idea that you're sitting around crafting a new way to ruin their day, right? And so then when you do finally reconnect, you've got a lot to share. They're hearing it from a very different place. I think as much as we stay focused on metrics and KPIs and data and business impact, I think how we do all of those things is ultimately driven and in many cases made successful by those soft skills and interpersonal skills and the relationships that they allow. Now, for a third perspective, and just a reminder to everybody before we go into this sort of last major section of the conversation, if you have questions for either Stephanie or Callum, go ahead and put those in the chat. I can also see there's something in the Q&A. I'll take a look in there in a minute as well. But for a third big perspective, it wouldn't be a modern event on procurement or supply chain if we didn't talk about risk. And there are some very real concerns, again, going back to the Economist Impact data around procurement's ability, or I should say the business's confidence in procurement's ability to manage internal and external risk. And currently, they've rated us at something like a 50-50, which is not necessarily where we want to be. Stephanie, if I start with you around risk, can you talk about some of the specific strategies your team has in place? And let's think about external risk here, managing the external risk associated with suppliers.
Well, one of the first thing is, of course, with the pandemic, we have been quite affected on our return. Supply chains were awful. Logistic-wise, to find, suppliers was complex. We've been quite affected to get back on our feet. There was a lot of discussions with the suppliers at that time. I would say the first thing on our side, we like to work with suppliers and have very long-lasting relationships. However, there's always, a balance that we need to keep. What if this supplier could go bankrupt? Anything could happen. So putting all our eggs in the same basket.
And Stephanie, I think I may have lost your audio for just a sec. So Callum, maybe let me switch and sort of bring that question over to you. If we think about, we talked earlier about the capabilities procurement has versus the perception of those capabilities. When it comes to our ability to manage internal and external risk, where do you think the business is getting that sense from? Are they pulling from specific reports? Are they looking at results? Or are they more going with their general gut sense of how is procurement doing? How effective are they being?
Yeah. I think ultimately it's coming down to the gut, right? In terms of, what are the issues that they're facing? What are the challenges? We spoke around just a moment ago, Kelly, around like that visibility. It's, how often am I facing that, I've sent a purchase order out, I'm following it, I don't have confirmation I've got a source of supply as well. Or for example, we've seen time and time again, I'm ordering from one part of the world from a single supplier, and then we're seeing some form of macroeconomic event or the country shut down, and I'm having to switch to procurement to keep my operation afloat as well. So I think it's that sentiment that's coming through. I think you'll see it in the data to kind of reinforce that. And I think that's what's manifesting that perspective as to, and influencing that confidence, right? I think it's that feeling component, but then influenced around the media and data points to support it.
Yeah. And Stephanie, I also want to give you the opportunity to sort of finish your thoughts. So you were talking about sort of the balancing act of building those relationships with suppliers, but at the same time, being aware that you do need to look objectively at their financial risk, their operational risk, even their brand risk, I'm sure, in some cases.
Definitely. So having a few suppliers, for the same service or goods you will purchase will be beneficial to us to ensure that we keep a healthy market and transparent and competitive suppliers. So definitely this is something we try to keep. And in some instances, for example, for us, the logistic we do is very specific to our business. So we do need to work with niche suppliers. So it's always, important to find the right balance and to ensure long-lasting relationship with the suppliers. So as we were speaking, communication internally is really important. But same with the suppliers, to keep them posted, to get their feedback, giving us feedback, just to ensure that we keep this relationship growing and active. I would maybe also add contractual standpoint of view. Minimizing the risk, definitely, if you have a good contract in place, but that will be strong for both parties. We're not there to be powerful against the supplier. Far from that, but we just want it to be a win-win situation and a fair play contract with both parties. So definitely, this would be something as well to mitigate the risk with the suppliers and the external side of things.
Well, and I always appreciate it when people talk about sort of having the two sides of the coin, right? Really, everything procurement has to do with the business. Maybe there's a little bit of a tweak, maybe you're a little bit less open with information, but there is a corresponding investment that has to be made with suppliers if the whole thing is going to come together and work. And especially when we think about that in the context of risk, sometimes we are working hand in hand with suppliers to manage risk that's further down in the supply chain. And so, Stephanie, I'm wondering if there's an example, you can be as specific or as general as you like, but of a positive experience you had with a supplier that ultimately ended up creating a positive or beneficial impact for Cirque du Soleil.
Well, there could be a lot of them. However, if I go quickly, and I would like to see it, the beneficial that it brings. I see it at different levels. So let's say, for example, in our team, we decided, and that was pre-pandemic, but we're still using this supplier. It's a supplier that does paver floors. So instead of for big top shows that are traveling from city to city, and we need to have a very tight, not tight, but niveled. Can I say that? Niveled
Yes.
floor,
Yep.
just to ensure that the big top will be right anchored and that everything is secured and in the right position. So we've been working with a company that does pavered and recycled tires. The pavers are made of tires recycled.
Yes.
And this does, of course, help us in reducing our costs from city to city. And then as well, basically, it's beneficial just on an ESG standpoint of view because we're working with recycled materials. So from me, this would be a success for us to say that we found someone in our team found this new supplier, and now we're working with them. But also, this is where I think for us, beneficial standpoint of view, yes, of course, there's the savings, definitely, but we also try to bring any other added value to the suppliers and the company. So nowadays we are strongly looking on an ESG side point of suppliers suppliers and side point of view, just to ensure that we also are optimizing our operations and goods, services that we would be using.
Now, Callum, we've spoken sort of generally to some extent about mid-sized companies today. We haven't done a ton of comparison by company size, but it is one of the interesting things that came out of the Economist Impact data that large enterprise confidence levels in procurement's ability to manage risk are actually much higher in large enterprises, somewhere around the 70% range, than they are at the 50-50 level in those mid-sized companies. Why do you think that stark difference in confidence in procurement's risk management abilities by company size?
To try and simplify it into just a couple of words, I think it ultimately comes down to capacity as well. So there was some research from going back a couple of years now done by PwC that looked at equipment rates, right? So what companies have a form of digital technology, whether that be across the strategic procurement side or across the procurement and accounts payable side. And what it found was that 78% of those that are entirely unequipped reside in the mid-market and small to medium enterprise. And so that means as we've had this relatively long period of stability up through to the pandemic as well, so 2020 and the world's really kind of flipped up. That kind of shifted this pace to needing data, to what Stephanie spoke. I need to find an alternate source of supply. I need to pivot here on the fly. And in many respects, we've been doing that time after time after time again over the past kind of 4 years. And so when you don't have the data, you're already capacity constrained just because of your organizational size. You're really starting on that back foot. So your ability to be able to do some of these things like communicate, engage the business, drive that strategic procurement becomes more and more strained, as to also how quickly you can react there as well. And so I think capacity plays a huge part of that in that as well. And then the capability part comes a little bit back into the thread there as well, right? So that Harvard Business Review study that I spoke about a little bit earlier, one of the things it found about around the data and talent was the ability to be able to attract talent, right, with these smaller organizations, right, top tier talent, the ability to be able to invest in training programs, upskilling, whether that be from a time capacity standpoint or a budgetary standpoint. So I think you've got this largely capacity, but then you'll see other things like capability and others start to come into play that just start to drive that stark difference.
Yeah. And it's interesting that Stephanie told the success story about the tires being recycled into the material for the pavers, because we also know from the research that, and in fact, in this case, regardless of company size, the business's confidence in procurement's ability to address ESG objectives is actually lower than their confidence around our ability to manage risk as a whole. Why do you think there's that lag factor around ESG as opposed to generalized risk or ability to collaborate? Why specifically the concern around ESG?
So I think ESG is such a broad topic as well, and it's being debated in different perspectives around different corners of the world, right? So what we see being discussed in the EU at the moment versus is North America are different elements of ESG. And so I think as that's being debated from a legislation standpoint and from a regulation standpoint as well, in terms of how that's all going to unfold, there's a lack of clarity around exactly where that's going, right? More broadly speaking. So there's a lot that procurement can do within the ESG to drive and better and further the business's goals around attracting new customers, right? Improving profitability, right? Driving all the ESG thresholds to move that forward. But there's also this uncertainty, right? Mm-hmm. Is a new law going to pass that's going to change the way I've got to report or a different data attributes I need to consider? And what does that mean? And because of that unknown, it drives that fear, it drives that uncertainty, and ultimately then erodes that confidence. Can we be capable of it? As well is starting to then come into the business's heads, and then that's going to reflect in on procurement and their confidence in procurement from a perception standpoint as well.
Now, as we start to kind of wind down the conversation, I always like to wrap with very specific pieces of advice and takeaways. I think it's so interesting to get to hear stories like this, Stephanie, based on your work directly at Cirque du Soleil, and Callum, based on your work both from research but then across companies. But if we can boil it down, Stephanie, we've talked about interpersonal skills, communication. We've talked about your approach to risk, the different models that you have with suppliers. We've talked about the impact that your transformation project, being able to speed procurement up and make it a shorter, more responsive process, some of the benefits that has driven. Given everything you've experienced and the outcomes that you've gotten to see, what would be a key piece of advice that you would offer to a procurement leader, a procurement team that's watching or listening and says, oh, that sounds fantastic. I want to get my team headed in that direction. What piece of advice would you offer them?
I would say to invest in their people, making sure, that there's chemistry within the team, because I think that's a key component that within ourselves, there's a synergy. In my team, I just want to make sure that the different divisions are speaking among themselves and working together to offer a better service offering to our internal clients. But then maybe I'm repeating myself, but communication will be one of the biggest takeaways that I would still continue using in my own department, being with our internal clients, being with our own team, being with our suppliers, and being with our stakeholders or executives where, we need to position ourselves. So definitely, I think investing and taking a little bit of, a step back and asking ourselves, how do we communicate? How can I improve myself, and where can I improve myself, just to ensure that the trust relationship that will be built within each of these different type of people. I'm sorry, maybe that's not the right word, but definitely, I think this is one. This is going to be one of the most important thing to have a strong procurement department.
Yeah. And I do actually think it's interesting and important to point both out that, yes, you want a certain kind of culture, you want the collaboration, you want the synergy. But depending on what level somebody is in right now, they may not have the ability to create that. But if they communicate more effectively, that is something that one person can control about the way they do their job internally, externally, right? At all different levels. I certainly agree that you can't overestimate the importance of communicating well, and always coming back to that sense of empathy. What is the person on the other side of this interaction experiencing? What might they think, regardless of what I know about it? Now, Callum, if I come to you for a slightly different sort of wrap up and takeaway piece of advice, we've talked about a lot of different findings specifically from Economist Impact, and you've pulled in Hackett, you've pulled in PwC, HBR, some other examples. When we think about advice for mid-sized organizations, are there any other pieces of advice, key findings, or benchmarks that you think it's helpful for people leading in procurement in those organizations to know about?
Yeah, there's one that comes top of mind as we speak, right? And I hear obviously Stephanie's experiences as well. And we've recently just done a study with partnering with Oxford Economics, right, which looked at 2,100 executives across different perspectives. 500 of those were procurement, but IT, finance, HR, et cetera, as well, to get a broad view. And some of the findings around that look at the top 4 kind of business goals, right? And it's what we'd expect, and it's what we somewhat know, but it's good to see in the data, because this is specific for mid-size. It's around growing revenue. It's around increasing the ability and understanding your spend data. Sorry, I'm getting too mixed up here. Let me start again. Right, in terms of goals, it's increasing revenue, attracting new customers, increasing profitability, and increasing speed and agility, all of which procurement can have a play, directly involved in or indirectly. When you flip that and have a look at the threats of the organization around those goals as well. Number 1, macroeconomic events, right? Number 2, the inability to effectively understand spend and spend visibility to influence, right, strategic stakeholders. Managing supplier and supplier relationships to ensure that's supply continuity and resiliency within your supply chain there as well, and then government regulations. And so when we look at the business goals and the threats, what we're seeing broadly is procurement has a really fantastic place to play, and then we can look at exactly how procurement drives that. But really, it starts with kind of benchmarking where you are today and how you can support the business over the next 3 to 5 years in realizing those goals. But that would be the one with Oxford Economics I really want to highlight and call out.
And the good news is there's no shortage of amazing data to sort of factor all of it together to give us more to think about. I think even to your earlier comment about how in mid-sized organizations, procurement just has to think differently about resources. They're not that large enterprises always have every resource they want, but there are different kinds of decisions around allocation and focus and where do you put certain resources that you have in those mid-sized companies that end up not just making procurement successful, but can actually down the road lead to an overall competitive advantage for the company as a whole. So this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. Stephanie and Callum, I can't thank both of you enough for your willingness to share, talking through specific findings, but then Stephanie also pulling in your firsthand experiences. And one of the things I want to make sure everybody knows, we've talked today a few times around the Economist Impact research. We will be sharing access to that report when we send out a link so that all of you can watch this event to your heart's content as many times as you like on demand. We will make sure that there's a link in there so that you can also pull down a copy of that report, read it for yourself. And of course, you know where to find me and my team if you have any questions at all. So Stephanie and Callum, with that, thank you both so much for sharing your time and your perspective today.